Hey listeners, this is Peter and welcome back to the History Shorts. Today's episode is brought to you by the podcast Republic, your ultimate listening app. Discover and subscribe to thousands of podcasts from around the world. Download Podcast Republic today, available on Google Play and the Apple App Store. Today on History Shorts. In December of 1823, President James Monroe stood before Congress and declared a message to the world. A message so bold, so revolutionary, that it would echo for the next 2 centuries. It was simple in principle, but seismic in consequence. The Americas were no longer open to European colonization. This was not just policy, it was a warning, a declaration that the New World would chart its own course, free from the meddling of the old. This is the story of the Monroe Doctrine, the speech that reshaped hemispheric politics, defined American foreign policy, and for better or worse, set the stage for the United States to rise as a global power. We will finish our episode with a history brief and a look back at some strange history. A quick word from our sponsors.
Hey guys, have you heard of Goldbelly? It's this amazing site where they ship the most iconic, famous foods from restaurants across the country, anywhere, nationwide. I've never found a more perfect gift than food. Goldbelly ships Chicago deep dish pizza, New York bagels, Maine lobster rolls, and even Ina Garden's famous cakes. So, if you're looking for a gift for the food lover in your life, head to goldbelly.com and get 20% off your first order with promo code GIFT. That's goldbelly.com, promo code GIFT.
This day in history. On February 8, 1587, Mary Queen of Scots was executed after nearly 19 years in captivity. Her death removed the rival to England's throne and hardened the divide between Protestant England and Catholic Europe. On February 8, 1960, the Hollywood Walk of Fame officially opened in Los Angeles, embedding thousands of stars into the sidewalk to honor figures in film, television, music, and radio. Story of the day. By the early 1820s, Europe was rebuilding after decades of Napoleonic wars. Monarchies that Napoleon had toppled were back on their thrones. The great powers, Britain, Austria, Prussia, and Russia, had formed the Holy Alliance, a conservative coalition determined to suppress revolutions and restore order across the continent. Meanwhile, on the other side of the Atlantic, revolution was spreading like wildfire. Across Latin America, colonies of Spain and Portugal, from Mexico to Argentina, were fighting for independence. Leaders like Simón Bolívar and José de San Martin dreamed of free republics modeled in part on the ideals of the American Revolution. By 1822, most of Spanish America had declared independence, but the monarchies of Europe weren't ready to accept it. Rumors swirled that the Holy Alliance might intervene, sending troops to help Spain reclaim its colonies in the New World. To the young United States, barely 40 years removed from its own revolution, that sounded like a nightmare. If Europe reasserted control in the Americas, it wouldn't just threaten new nations, it could also threaten the US itself. And so, under President James Monroe, the United States prepared to make its stand. Though Monroe's name would adorn the doctrine, its intellectual architect was his Secretary of State, John Quincy Adams, the brilliant, stubborn, and deeply principled son of President John Adams. Adams understood diplomacy as both art and chess. He believed that America must stay out of European wars, but also that Europe must stay out of American affairs. When George Canning, the British Foreign Secretary, proposed a joint US-British declaration warning against new European colonies in the Americas, many in Monroe's cabinet supported it. Britain, after all, had its own reasons. Its navy dominated the seas, and it wanted to protect its growing trade with the new Latin American republics from continental interference. But Adams disagreed. He famously told Monroe, "It would be more candid as well as more dignified to avow our principles explicitly to Russia and France than to come in as a cockboat in the wake of the British man of war." In other words, America should speak for itself, not as a junior partner, not as an echo of Britain's empire, but as a sovereign power. On December 2nd, 1823, Monroe delivered his annual message to Congress, a message that would become one of the most consequential in American history. It wasn't called the Monroe Doctrine then, that title came later, but its essence was unmistakable. Monroe declared that the Western Hemisphere was closed to further European colonization. He warned that any attempt by European powers to interfere in the affairs of independent nations in the Americas would be considered dangerous to our peace and safety. In return, the United States pledged to stay out of European conflicts and not meddle in existing colonies. It was a statement of mutual non-interference, but also a bold claim of hemispheric guardianship. The world was listening. To European monarchs, it sounded like arrogance, a tiny republic of just 10 million people presuming to dictate terms to the great empires of the world. But to Latin American nations, it was a symbol of solidarity, a promise that the United States recognized their independence and would oppose efforts to crush it. To Americans, it was the beginning of something even greater, the idea that their nation was destined to protect freedom in the Western Hemisphere. Here's the irony, though. In 1823, the United States had no army or navy strong enough to enforce the said Monroe Doctrine. Its power rested entirely on the Royal Navy of Great Britain, the very empire that Adams refused to join. It was British warships, not American ones, that ultimately deterred European intervention in Latin America. Still, the declaration carried some moral weight. It articulated an idea, a line in the sand that would over time become a cornerstone of American identity. The Monroe Doctrine announced to the world that the Western Hemisphere was no longer Europe's playground. The new world would belong to the new nations, and the United States, above all, would watch over it. For the next several decades, the Monroe Doctrine lay mostly dormant. It was occasionally invoked. For instance, when President James Polk used it to justify opposing European interference during the Mexican-American War. But it wasn't yet the bedrock of American foreign policy. That changed in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. As the United States grew stronger, industrially, militarily, and economically, the Monroe Doctrine evolved from a defensive principle into a tool of expansion and intervention. In 1895, during a border dispute between Venezuela and British Guyana, President Grover Cleveland invoked the doctrine to demand arbitration, declaring that any European intrusion in the Americas would be met as a deliberate aggression. It was a turning point, a moment when the U.S. began enforcing the doctrine not just as a warning, but as a right of regional dominance. Then came the Roosevelt Corollary in 1904. President Theodore Roosevelt, riding high on America's new global power, reinterpreted Monroe's message. He declared that the U.S. had not only the right to oppose European intervention in the Western Hemisphere, but also the responsibility to intervene itself in Latin American nations whose, and I quote, domestic affairs invite foreign involvement, end quote. In short, the U.S. became the self-appointed policeman of the Americas. It was a dramatic departure from Monroe's original intent, and one that Latin American nations often viewed as imperialism under another name. Throughout the 20th century, the Monroe Doctrine continued to evolve, invoked by presidents from Kennedy to Reagan as both shield and sword. During the Cold War, it became a tool of containment. When the Soviet Union tried to install nuclear missiles in Cuba in 1962, President John F. Kennedy invoked the Monroe Doctrine directly, declaring that the United States would not tolerate foreign military powers in the Western Hemisphere. The Cuban Missile Crisis was, in many ways, the ultimate test of Monroe's warning, and it reaffirmed the doctrine's relevance in a nuclear age. Later in the 1980s, Ronald Reagan used it to justify intervention in Central America, proclaiming that Marxist revolutions in Nicaragua or El Salvador threatened our own security. Each generation reshaped the doctrine to fit its fears: monarchy, imperialism, communism, and more recently, terrorism. But its central idea remained that the Western Hemisphere was America's sphere of influence. In 2013, Secretary of State John Kerry declared that the era of the Monroe Doctrine is over. But in truth, you still hear about it in today's news. The History Brief. The following comes to us from Strange History, published by Portable Press in 2016. In 1800, a pirate named Joseph Baker from Canada signed on to the merchant ship Eliza. Not long after the ship set sail, Baker decided that he wanted to be the captain, so he, along with 2 other crewmen, attacked the first mate during a night watch and tossed him overboard. Then the 3 pirates went after the captain, William Wieland. They wounded him during a brief skirmish and took him hostage. But there was a problem. While discussing where to sell the ship's cargo, the mutineers realized that none of them actually knew how to navigate a ship. Sensing an opportunity, Wieland offered to sail them anywhere they wanted, if they spared his life. Baker agreed to the deal, but he was a pirate after all, so he boasted to his fellow culprits that he'd kill Captain Wieland as soon as they sighted land. But Wieland overheard them and hatched a plan of his own. He locked the 2 other conspirators in the hold, caught Baker by surprise, and chased him up the mainmast. Wieland kept Baker up there, lashed to the mast until they landed on St. Kitts in West Indies, and then turned him over to the authorities. After a 4-day trial in April 1800, Baker, the poor excuse for a pirate, was hanged. Thank you so much for spending some time with me today and for helping me make this little show such a mighty success. If you enjoy the show and would like to help with its production, you can always donate a few dollars at buymeacoffee.com or become our Patreon member to enjoy these episodes ad-free. Both links can be found on the website at www.historyshortspodcast.com. Have a great rest of your day, and I will talk to you all again tomorrow.